The year is 1903. Behind the grand curtain of a Berlin theatre, the air hangs thick with gaslight and velvet dust, mixing with the sharp scent of cheap perfume and nervous sweat. From beyond the heavy fabric comes the thunder of applause, thousands of hands beating together like a storm against the theatre walls. On stage, a compact man with intense dark eyes takes his final bow, his evening coat catching the footlights as he raises his arms in triumph. The crowd sees Harry Houdini, the handcuff king, the man who can escape from anything. But in the shadows at the back of the theatre, where the gaslight doesn't quite reach, stand men in dark coats who see something else entirely. They see an asset, a weapon dressed in a magician's silk. Welcome to the double life of the world's greatest escape artist, a man who performed on 2 stages, one bathed in spotlight, the other cloaked in secrecy. This is the story of how Eric Weiss, a rabbi's son from Budapest, transformed himself into Harry Houdini and then transformed again into something darker, a spy moving through the shadow world of international espionage, where the locks that mattered couldn't be picked and the only escape was death. Tonight, we peel back the curtain on a man whose greatest trick wasn't escaping from handcuffs or water tanks. It was convincing the world he was free while wearing chains that no audience could see. Chains forged not from iron, but from secrets, allegiances, and the terrible weight of knowing too much. While others sleep soundly, I unlock the acts they never put on stage. Consider subscribing if you want to hear what else was hidden behind smoke and mirrors, and drop a comment with where you're listening from. Even illusions need an audience. Now settle in, let your breathing slow, and let me take you to London at the turn of the century, where in a smoke-filled office above Scotland Yard, a friendship would form that would bind Harry Houdini tighter than any shackle ever could. To understand how the world's most famous escape artist became entangled in the web of international espionage, you first have to understand the hunger that drove him. Eric Weiss arrived in America as a child, crammed into the fetid hold of a ship with hundreds of other Hungarian immigrants, breathing air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and desperation. His father, Rabbi Samuel Weiss, had promised them a new life in the land of opportunity. What they found instead was a cold tenement in Wisconsin, where the learned rabbi discovered that his scholarship meant nothing in a country that valued only what you could build with your hands. The boy who would become Houdini learned early that in America, you had to remake yourself or be crushed. He watched his father fail, saw the light dim in the old man's eyes as congregation after congregation rejected him, as poverty pressed down on their family like a weight that grew heavier each year. The smell of that failure, boiled cabbage and damp wool and disappointment, would follow young Eric for the rest of his life, driving him forward with a desperation that looked, from the outside, like ambition. By the time he was 20, Eric Weiss was gone, replaced by Harry Houdini, a name stolen from a French magician and hammered into something that sounded American. Successful, important. But even with his new name and his growing skills, success eluded him. He and his wife Bess performed in dime museums that reeked of sawdust and stale beer, sharing bills with sword swallowers and bearded ladies. They even ran a fraudulent spiritualist act for a time, learning how to read the grief in people's faces, how to tell them what they wanted to hear about their dead. It left a taste in his mouth bitter as grave dirt, but it taught him something valuable. Everyone had secrets they were desperate to hide, and everyone had losses they were desperate to reclaim. Then came London and William Melville. The year was 1900, and Houdini had scraped together enough money for passage to Europe, betting everything on the chance that old world audiences might appreciate what American crowds had ignored. London sprawled before him like a promise written in soot and stone, its streets slick with spring rain that carried the industrial stink of the Thames. The meeting that would change everything wasn't supposed to be a meeting at all. Houdini's manager, a theatrical agent named C. Dundas Slater who affected a monocle he didn't need, and cologne that didn't quite mask the gin on his breath, had been trying to book his client into the better music halls. But the theatre owners were sceptical. Another escapologist? London had seen dozens. What made this American different? Slater, with the desperate creativity of a man who saw his commission slipping away, proposed something audacious. What if Houdini escaped from Scotland Yard itself? What better endorsement than the approval of London's legendary police force? The challenge was delivered to Superintendent William Melville's office on a grey June morning. Melville was not what Houdini had expected. The newspapers painted Scotland Yard detectives as square-jawed champions of justice. But the man who received them looked more like an undertaker. Thin, pale, with eyes the colour of old ice. He had the soft voice of a priest and hands that never stopped moving, sorting through papers on his desk as if looking for something he'd lost. The office smelled of coal smoke and secrets. Photographs covered one wall. Anarchists with wild eyes. Irish revolutionaries with grim mouths. Faces marked with the X of the captured or dead. This was the man who had stopped the Jubilee plot, who had spent years in the shadows fighting enemies that most of London didn't even know existed. Melville listened to Slater's breathless pitch with the patience of a cat watching a mouse hole. When the agent finally wound down, the superintendent's thin lips curved in what might have been a smile. He spoke with a faint Irish accent that years in London hadn't quite erased, suggesting that perhaps a demonstration would be instructive. He produced a pair of regulation handcuffs from his desk drawer, their steel catching the gaslight like teeth. What happened next would be told and retold until it became legend. But the truth was both simpler and more complex than any version Houdini would later share with reporters. The superintendent cuffed Houdini's hands behind his back with practiced efficiency, the metal cold and final against his wrists. Then, instead of leaving as the story would later claim, Melville sat back in his chair and watched. The room filled with a silence thick as Thames fog. Slater's nervous breathing was the only sound as Houdini worked, his shoulders moving in ways that seemed to defy anatomy. Melville's pale eyes never left him, and in them Houdini saw something that made his blood run cold. Recognition. Not of his skill with locks, but of something deeper. This man had seen through the performance to what lay beneath. The desperate hunger, the willingness to do anything to succeed. The handcuffs clattered to the floor after less than 2 minutes. Slater burst into applause, but Melville simply nodded, as if confirming something he'd already known. He thanked them for the demonstration, mentioning almost casually that it might be useful to discuss Mr. Houdini's upcoming European tour, privately, without Mr. Slater. The manager protested, but something in Melville's tone, polite as an executioner, brooked no argument. He left, trailing cologne and confusion, and suddenly the office felt smaller, the photographs on the wall more ominous. Melville poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a crystal decanter that looked too fine for a policeman's salary. The liquor burned, but not as much as the superintendent's next words. He spoke of mutual benefit, of a magician who could go places a policeman couldn't, who could open locks that weren't made of metal. Of course, Melville continued, studying his whiskey as if it held secrets. Such theoretical services would be compensated not in coin, but in something far more valuable. Influence, introductions, the kind of assistance that could transform a struggling variety act into an international sensation. The offer hung in the air between them like smoke from Melville's Turkish cigarette. Houdini understood what wasn't being said. This soft-voiced man with undertaker's hands wasn't really a policeman at all. The photographs on the wall weren't trophies. They were a catalogue of the shadow war Melville fought daily, a war that had no rules except survival. In that moment, Houdini faced a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. He could walk out, return to the grinding circuit of third-rate theatres and dwindling hopes, Or he could take the hand that Melville extended across the desk, pale and soft as a corpse's, but offering everything he'd ever wanted. The handshake was brief, businesslike, but Houdini felt the weight of it like shackles clicking closed. He had just made a bargain with a man whose real name might not even be William Melville, in an office that might not really belong to Scotland Yard, for services that would never be officially acknowledged. As he left the building, walking back into London's grey afternoon, Houdini thought he understood what he'd agreed to. He would perform a few favours, gather some information during his travels, and in exchange, doors would open that had always been closed to a Hungarian rabbi's son. It seemed like such a small price. He couldn't know that he'd just forged the first link in a chain that would drag him through the palaces and prisons of Europe, that would transform his escapes from entertainment into espionage, that would make him the most famous man in the world and the loneliest. The boy who had fled poverty in Budapest had just signed a contract that no amount of success could ever pay off. In the gaslight of that London afternoon, Harry Houdini the entertainer took his final bow. What emerged from Scotland Yard was something else. A man with a public face and a secret purpose, doomed to perform on 2 stages for the rest of his life. The transformation was swift and absolute. Within weeks of that handshake in Melville's office, doors that had been firmly shut began to swing open with mysterious ease. Theatre managers who had barely glanced at Houdini's promotional materials now sought him out. Newspaper critics who had ignored his performances suddenly found them worthy of front-page coverage. The machinery of success had begun to turn, oiled by invisible hands, but every gift from the shadow world came with a price, paid in reports written in hotel rooms that smelled of foreign tobacco and fear. Berlin, 1900. The city sprawled before him like a military diagram, all straight lines and right angles, as if Prussia had tried to impose order on chaos itself. The autumn air carried the bite of coming winter and the acrid smell of coal smoke from 1,000 chimneys. In his room at the Hotel Adlon, Houdini prepared for what would appear to be his greatest triumph yet, a public challenge to the Berlin police force. The invitation had come through channels that seemed official but probably weren't. Police Chief Leopold von Meerscheidt-Hüllersum, a man whose name was as rigid as his posture, had agreed to test this American escape artist who claimed no restraints could hold him. What the chief didn't know was that his department had been carefully selected, studied, evaluated for weeks by eyes that never seemed to blink. The morning of the challenge dawned grey and bitter. The police station on Alexanderplatz loomed like a fortress, its stones dark with soot and age. Inside, 300 policemen had gathered, an audience of professional skeptics whose faces showed the hard certainty that this American would fail like all the others who had tried to make fools of German authority. They stripped him naked. This was standard procedure. They explained in clipped English as to ensure no hidden tools or keys, but Houdini understood the deeper purpose: humiliation, the reduction of a man to meat and bone, vulnerability made visible. He stood there in the cold station house, his skin puckering with goosebumps, while German eyes examined him with the same dispassion they might show a suspect or a corpse. The smell of the place worked its way into his nostrils, gun oil and leather, the sour sweat of authority, the particular mixture of coffee and cigarettes that seemed to permeate every police station from London to Budapest. They brought out their finest restraints, thumbscrews that bit into flesh like metal teeth, finger locks that turned hands into useless claws, leg irons that had held anarchists and murderers. They applied them all with methodical German efficiency, until Houdini stood before them like a monument to imprisonment. What happened next would make headlines across Europe, but the newspapers would miss the real story. As Houdini worked, his body contorting in ways that made even hardened policemen wince, his mind catalogued everything: the layout of the station, with its vulnerable points and escape routes, the quality of German steel in their restraints, superior to what he'd encountered in London or Paris. The faces of the officers, who looked merely sceptical, who looked suspicious, who looked like they might be something more than simple policemen. 27 minutes later, he stood free, the restraints scattered at his feet like shed snakeskin. The room erupted, not in applause, but in something more valuable: dismay, confusion, the sound of certainty cracking. Chief von Meerscheidt Hillesum himself stepped forward, his monocle glinting, to shake Houdini's hand and declare that what they had witnessed was impossible, yet undeniable. That night, in his hotel room, Houdini wrote 2 accounts of the day. The first was for the press, colourful, boastful, full of theatrical detail about his triumph over German authority. The second was different. A careful report noting the presence of 3 officers who wore their uniforms wrongly, whose eyes had watched not his escape but the reactions of their colleagues, who might have been Prussian military intelligence observing their own police. This second report would travel to London through channels that didn't officially exist, to be read by men whose names he would never know. The German tour continued through the winter, each city bringing new challenges, new police stations to conquer, new intelligence to gather. In Munich, while escaping from Bavarian shackles, he noted the arrival of new Krupp artillery pieces being tested at the nearby proving grounds. Information gleaned from a boastful lieutenant who thought he was impressing a mere entertainer. In Hamburg, performing at the docks, he observed the construction techniques of a new U-boats, their design still secret but visible to a man trained to see what others missed. But it was in Cologne that the perfect cover began to show its first cracks. The newspaper was called the Rheinische Zeitung, and the article appeared on a Tuesday morning, the ink still wet with malice. Houdini the Fraud, screamed the headline, above a story claiming that patrolman Werner Graf had caught the escapologist attempting to bribe him for a key to a special police lock. The accusation was specific, detailed, damning. Houdini's first instinct was to ignore it, to leave town and let the story die. But a telegram arrived at his hotel that afternoon. Sender unnamed. Message clear. Sue them. Stop. Make it public. Stop. Full support guaranteed. Stop. The trial became a sensation. The Cologne courtroom filled with spectators eager to see the American magician exposed or exonerated. But for Houdini, sitting at the defendant's table in a building that smelled of old wood and older justice, the proceedings felt like a trap within a trap. He testified that it was Graf who had approached him, offering to provide a special demonstration for a fee, that when Houdini refused, the policeman had given him a lock that was welded shut, impossible to open by any means. The courtroom gasped at the implications, but Houdini saw something else in the gallery. Men in civilian clothes whose bearing screamed military, whose eyes weren't watching him but studying everyone else, cataloguing who had come to witness this trial and why. The judge, a thin man with the face of a disappointed teacher, finally proposed a solution. Would Herr Houdini consent to demonstrate his abilities here, in court, to settle the matter definitively? They brought Graf's lock, along with chains that looked like they had last been used during the Napoleonic Wars. The judge cleared a corner of the courtroom, allowing Houdini to work while hidden from most eyes. But not all. The watching men in the gallery had shifted positions for better views. As he worked, Houdini felt the familiar dance of metal and flesh, the subtle conversation between lock and pick that was more intuition than technique. But underneath ran a colder current. The knowledge that this was not just about his reputation. This was a test, a public demonstration that would either cement his cover or destroy it entirely. The lock yielded in 4 minutes. The chains took another 3. When he emerged, the courtroom erupted in chaos. Applause, shouts, the bang of the judge's gavel trying to restore order. The verdict was inevitable. Acquittal, vindication, triumph. But that night, as Houdini packed to leave Cologne, he found an envelope slipped under his door. Inside, a single photograph. Himself. Taken during the trial, but from an angle that should have been impossible. Someone had been watching from above, from a position that didn't exist in the courtroom's public architecture. On the back, in precise German script, "We are always watching." Russia came next, in the spring of 1903. And if Germany had been a test, Russia was an examination that could end in death. The train journey from Berlin to St. Petersburg took 3 days through a landscape that grew progressively more alien. Endless forests of birch and pine, villages that seemed unchanged since medieval times, a horizon that stretched forever under grey skies. At each border crossing, the inspections grew more intense, the officials more suspicious. By the time they reached Russian territory, Houdini felt like he was entering a vast prison where everyone was both guard and inmate. St. Petersburg rose from the marshes like a fever dream of European grandeur, its pastel palaces and golden domes unable to fully mask the rot beneath. The city smelled of canal water and corruption, of French perfume trying to cover the stench of Russian reality. Here, Houdini would perform not just for audiences but for the Romanov court itself, where every smile hid a dagger and every friendship was a potential betrayal. His handler at the Winter Palace was a count whose name seemed to change depending on who was asking. The man had perfect French, terrible English, and eyes that had seen too much. He explained, with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather, that Houdini would be watched every moment of his stay. The Okhrana, the Tsar's secret police, did not trust foreign performers, especially Jewish ones. The anti-Semitism was like a constant pressure, a weight on every interaction. Houdini felt it in the way officials examined his papers, in the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered a room, in the signs on certain establishments that made it clear his money might be welcome but he was not. He had escaped Hungary to flee this poison, only to find it distilled to its essence in the heart of the Russian Empire. His first performance for the court was in a private theatre that smelled of dust and decaying velvet. The audience glittered with medals and jewels, their faces showing the particular boredom of people who'd seen everything and been impressed by nothing. In the royal box sat Nicholas II himself, a small man who looked like he was drowning in his own uniform, flanked by his German wife whose eyes never stopped moving, searching for threats or exits. But it was the figure standing in the shadows behind them that made Houdini's blood run cold. Tall, gaunt, with mad monk's eyes that seemed to see through flesh to the soul beneath. Grigory Rasputin, a holy man whose influence over the royal family was already the subject of whispered scandal. When their eyes met across the theatre, Houdini felt a recognition between fellow deceivers, fellow performers who had learned to make the impossible seem real. The show went flawlessly. Houdini escaped from Siberian transport chains, from manacles that had held Decembrist revolutionaries, from a sealed trunk that was said to have been used by Ivan the Terrible himself. Each escape brought gasps and applause, but he could feel Rasputin's eyes on him, evaluating, measuring, seeing perhaps too much. After the performance, at the reception that followed, the holy man approached him. He smelled of unwashed wool and something else. Power, perhaps, or madness. Through an interpreter, Rasputin suggested that they had much in common. Both of them transformed reality through will alone. Both of them served masters who didn't fully understand what they had employed. The words were casual, but the threat underneath was sharp as Siberian ice. That night, writing his report in a hotel room where he had already found 3 listening devices, Houdini detailed not just the court's fascination with mysticism, but the deeper rot he sensed. The empire was dying, held together by fear and tradition, ready to collapse at the first real shock. The intelligence he gathered would be valuable, but the cost of obtaining it grew higher with each day. The final test came at Moscow's Butyrskaya prison, a fortress of stone and misery where political prisoners disappeared into cells that might as well have been graves. The challenge had been arranged at the highest levels. Houdini would attempt to escape from a Siberian transport cell, the rolling iron coffins used to carry prisoners to exile or execution. They stripped him again, but this time the search was different. The guards' hands were not just professional but cruel, probing and prodding with a thoroughness that went beyond security into humiliation. They were looking for more than hidden keys. They were looking for weakness, for the flaw that would let them break him. The transport cell was a masterpiece of hopelessness. Iron walls so thick that no sound could escape. A lock mechanism that required 3 separate keys held by 3 different officials. Air holes so small that every breath became a struggle. They sealed him inside with the satisfaction of men locking away a problem. In the darkness, Houdini worked, but this was different from any escape he had performed. The lock was not just mechanical but political, designed by a paranoid state to be absolutely inescapable. As he struggled with the mechanism, feeling the air grow thinner, he realized that this might be more than a test. Someone, Rasputin, the Okhrana, his own handlers, might have decided that a dead escape artist tell no tales. 45 minutes passed. Outside, he could hear muffled voices growing concerned, then angry. His lungs burned. His fingers bled from the effort. But finally, he felt the tumblers align, the massive lock yield to his will. He emerged gasping, triumphant, into a room full of faces that showed disappointment rather than amazement. Chief Lebedev, the prison commandant, refused to provide the promised certificate of his escape. The official reason was bureaucratic. Proper forms hadn't been filed. The real reason was written in his eyes. Houdini had shown that even the Russian state's most secure restraints could be defeated. Such knowledge was dangerous. Such a man was dangerous. He left Russia quickly after that, sensing that his welcome had expired along with his usefulness. On the train west, watching the endless forest blur past, he understood that he had gathered intelligence that would be valuable to his handlers. But he had also seen too much, learned too much, become too visible. The perfect cover was developing cracks that all his skill couldn't repair. Back in London, in a safe house that smelled of tea and damp wool, he delivered his reports to men whose names he never learned. They thanked him, paid him in introductions and influence, and sent him back out into the world. But Houdini knew the truth now. He wasn't escaping from handcuffs and chains anymore. He was performing a different kind of escape, one that became more desperate with each tour, each challenge, each state secret he uncovered. He was trying to escape from the life he had chosen, even as that life made him the most famous man in the world. By 1914, Harry Houdini was the highest paid performer on Earth. His name blazed from theatre marquees in every major city. His face stared from posters on every street corner, and his escapes drew crowds that blocked traffic and required police control. He had everything he had dreamed of in those desperate days in the dime museums. Fame, fortune, the respect denied to a rabbi's son from Budapest. He also had shadows that followed him through every city, mail that arrived already opened, and hotel rooms that were searched with such professional skill that only someone trained to notice would see the signs. The perfect cover had become a perfect trap. The outbreak of the Great War changed everything. The shadow games played between nations erupted into open slaughter, and suddenly the intelligence that men like Houdini gathered was no longer about diplomatic advantage, but about survival itself. In his New York mansion, surrounded by the trappings of success, walls lined with locks from every nation, libraries full of books on the occult and escapology, he received a visitor who didn't officially exist. The man gave no name, showed no credentials, but Houdini recognized the type. He had Melville's soft voice and dead eyes, though his accent was pure American establishment. Harvard, perhaps, or Yale. He spoke of patriotic duty, of the threat German U-boats posed to American shipping, of lives that could be saved if certain information reached the right hands. The offer was elegant in its simplicity. Houdini would volunteer to train sailors in escape techniques, a natural extension of his public persona. No one would question why the world's greatest escape artist wanted to help American servicemen learn to escape from sunken submarines. But while conducting this training, he would also observe, evaluate, report on naval preparations, new technologies, personnel who might be susceptible to foreign influence. It was presented as voluntary. But Houdini understood the steel beneath the silk. He knew too much to be allowed genuine retirement. His years of moving through the shadow world had made him valuable, and valuable assets were never simply discarded. They were used until they broke, or until they became more trouble than they were worth. The training sessions took place at naval bases that smelled of salt water and machine oil. Houdini taught young sailors, boys really, with fresh faces that hadn't yet learned to be afraid, how to escape from handcuffs, how to hold their breath, how to remain calm when panic meant death. But even as he demonstrated techniques that might save their lives, he was observing, cataloguing, filing away details about America's naval preparedness that would find their way into reports he wrote in the small hours of the morning. The paranoia that had been growing for years now bloomed into full flower. He began to see surveillance everywhere, in the man reading a newspaper who appeared too often at his performances, in the cleaning woman at his hotel who asked too many questions, in the click on his telephone line that suggested someone else was listening. The skills that had made him a master performer, the ability to read a room, to sense danger, to know when someone was lying, now made every interaction a minefield of potential betrayal. His escapes became more dangerous, more desperate. Where once he had carefully calculated each risk, now he pushed boundaries that should not be pushed. The milk can escape gave way to the water torture cell, and even that wasn't enough. He had to go deeper, darker, closer to the edge where performance met death. The Chinese water torture cell was his masterpiece of masochism. Suspended upside down by his ankles, his feet locked in stocks, he would be lowered into a glass-fronted cabinet filled with water. The audience could see everything, his face contorting as he held his breath, his body writhing as he worked to free himself, the clock ticking away the seconds until drowning became inevitable. But for Houdini, hanging inverted in that cabinet was the only time he felt truly in control anymore. The locks were straightforward. Pick them or die. The water was honest in its lethality. Breathe it and drown. There were no hidden meanings, no double agents, no reports to file afterward. Just him, the restraints, and death waiting patiently for him to make a mistake. One night in Detroit, something went wrong. The mechanism that was supposed to lower him smoothly into the water jerked, twisted. He felt something tear in his ankle, a white-hot bolt of pain that shot up his leg like electricity. Suspended upside down, his foot trapped at an unnatural angle, the water rising past his face. He had a moment of perfect clarity. This was how it would end. Not in some foreign prison. Not the hands of the Okrana or German intelligence, but here, in front of a paying audience who thought they were watching a performance. He would die as he had lived. Publicly, spectacularly, and utterly alone despite the crowd. But the body has its own intelligence, its own will to survive. His hands, trained by decades of practice, continued working even as his vision began to go dark. The stocks released just as his lungs screamed for air, and he broke the surface gasping, alive, triumphant. The audience erupted, thinking they had witnessed the greatest escape of his career. They couldn't know they had witnessed something else, a man at the absolute limit of his endurance, escaping not just from the torture cell but from the weight of his own existence. His handlers wanted more. They always wanted more. The war had ended, but the intelligence games continued. Now it was the Bolsheviks who needed watching, the anarchists who needed infiltrating, the labour unions who might be fronts for foreign agitation. Houdini found himself performing for audiences that included known radicals. His reports now focusing on Americans whose only crime was believing the world could be better than it was. He began hunting spiritualists with the fervour of a man seeking redemption. These mediums who claimed to speak with the dead, to bridge the gap between this world and the next. He exposed them all, revealed their tricks, showed their seances to be nothing but clever theatre. But his crusade had a desperate quality, as if by exposing their deceptions he could somehow cleanse his own. The irony wasn't lost on him. He who had spent his life deceiving others, who had made his fortune on the principle that nothing was as it seemed, now raged against deception. In hotel rooms across America, he would write two kinds of letters: public denunciations of fraudulent mediums and private reports on the political leanings of those who attended their seances. Both kinds of writing left him feeling hollow, used up, a shell of the man who had once believed that success would bring freedom. His body was failing. The years of contortion, of pushing beyond human limits, had taken their toll. His kidney ached from blows he'd taken during challenges. His ankle, never properly healed from that night in Detroit, sent shooting pains up his leg with every step. But worse than the physical pain was the mental exhaustion, the weight of carrying so many secrets, of never being able to trust anyone completely. Not even Bess, his wife, who looked at him sometimes with eyes full of questions he could never answer. He performed the water torture cell in Montreal on a cold October night in 1926. The theatre was packed, the audience eager to see the great Houdini risk death for their entertainment. As they locked him into the stocks, as the water rose around his inverted body, he had a moment of perfect understanding. Every lock he had ever picked had been practice for this moment. Every escape had been a rehearsal. But the final lock was one he had forged himself, out of ambition and desperation, and the terrible need to be more than Eric Weiss from Budapest. He had built a prison of success and secrets, of public fame and private shame, and the only key was one he could never bring himself to use: the simple act of walking away. The water covered his face, and he began to work. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, but his mind was elsewhere, floating in that space between consciousness and dream, where all escape seemed possible. He saw himself as he truly was, not the great Houdini, but a tired man in a tank of water, performing tricks for strangers while the real chains that bound him remained unbreakable. He escaped that night, as he always did. The crowd roared its approval, and he took his bows, water still dripping from his hair. But backstage, toweling himself dry with hands that shook slightly, he knew the truth. He had spent his life mastering the art of escape, but he had never learned the most important lesson of all. Some prisons are of our own making, and from these there is no escape. There's only the performance, repeated again and again, until the final curtain falls. They found him in his dressing room at the Princess Theatre in Montreal, October 31st, 1926, Halloween. How fitting for a man who had lived his entire life behind masks. The official cause was peritonitis from a ruptured appendix, aggravated by his refusal to seek medical attention. He had continued performing despite the pain, despite his body's desperate signals that something was terribly wrong. But those who knew, really knew, understood that Harry Houdini had been dying for years. Each escape had taken something from him. Each secret carved away another piece of his soul, until all that remained was the performance itself. In his final moments, as the morphine dulled the pain and the world began to fade, perhaps he found himself back in that first moment of choice, standing in Melville's office, the taste of whiskey on his tongue. the weight of decision heavy in the air. How different might his life have been if he had walked away, chosen poverty with freedom over success with chains. But that was the greatest illusion of all. There had never been a choice. Not really. The boy who had watched his father fail, who had smelled the stench of poverty and tasted the bitterness of being nobody. That boy could never have walked away from the promise of becoming somebody, no matter the cost. The newspapers called him the master of escape, the man who could slip any bond, defeat any lock. They filled their obituaries with breathless accounts of his most spectacular feats, the vanishing elephant, the suspended straitjacket, the buried alive stunts that had thrilled millions. They spoke of his crusade against spiritualist frauds, his tireless work to expose those who preyed on the grieving. What they didn't write about, couldn't write about, were the other escapes. The information he had gathered in police stations across Europe, the reports filed in hotel rooms that smelled of fear, the double life that had made him rich and famous and utterly, profoundly alone. William Melville had died years before, taking his secrets to a grave that bore a name that might not have been real. The men who had handled Houdini after, American intelligence, British operatives, shadowy figures who appeared and disappeared like spirits at a séance. They attended no funeral, sent no flowers. In the world of shadows where Houdini had lived his second life, death was simply the final exit, noteworthy only for the operational void it created. His wife Bess kept a séance every Halloween for 10 years, waiting for the message he had promised to send from beyond if such communication were possible. She sat in darkened rooms, surrounded by candles and true believers, hoping for a sign that somewhere, somehow, Harry had finally escaped the ultimate trap. The sign never came. Of course it didn't. Houdini knew better than anyone that the dead tell no tales, reveal no secrets, expose no handlers. Death was the one honest thing in a life built on deception. Final, irreversible, and blessedly silent. But perhaps that silence was his last and greatest escape. In death, he was finally free from the watchers and the handlers, the coded messages and the double meanings, the public face and the private shame, the chains that had bound him, made of secrets rather than steel, forged from ambition rather than iron, fell away like stage props when the show was over. The legacy he left was as double-edged as his life had been. To the public, he remained the great Houdini, the man who made the impossible possible, who showed that with enough will and skill, any bond could be broken. His name became synonymous with escape itself, a metaphor for freedom that would outlive the man by decades. To the shadow world he had served, he was something else, a cautionary tale about assets who become too visible, too famous, too difficult to control. The perfect cover only works if it remains a cover. When the asset becomes larger than the mission, when the performance overwhelms the purpose, problems arise that cannot be solved with traditional methods. In the end, Harry Houdini proved that you could escape from anything except yourself. Every lock he picked, every chain he shed, every death-defying stunt he performed was an attempt to break free from the fundamental trap of his own existence. The immigrant boy who would do anything to succeed. The ambitious performer who traded his soul for applause. The spy who discovered that the deepest cover is the one you pull over your own eyes. He had spent his life creating illusions for others while living the greatest illusion of all. That fame meant freedom, that success meant escape, that if you ran fast enough and climbed high enough, you could leave your shadows behind. But shadows have a way of keeping pace, growing longer as the sun sets, until finally they merge with the coming night. And in that darkness, all escapes become equal, all performers take their final bow, and even the greatest magician must confront the one trick he can never master, the art of being truly, honestly, simply himself. Rest now, in the quiet aftermath of a story that reminds us that the most inescapable prisons are the ones we build for ourselves, link by link, choice by choice, until we can no longer remember a time when we were free. The water is still, the locks are open, the performance is over, and somewhere in the silence between sleeping and waking, perhaps we can hear what Harry Houdini spent his whole life trying to tell us, that the greatest escape of all is the one we never attempt, the escape from the need to escape.